Welcome to today's webinar titled A Guide to Helping Children Manage Anger, ages 3 to 12. We are thrilled to have Michael Scott with us today. Michael Scott was raised in a military family and remembers well the many rewards and challenges experienced as a child with a father in the Navy. As an adult, Michael attained a master's degree in counseling from Old Dominion University and has experience providing counseling to military families and their children as a therapist in a children's mental health inpatient facility. Michael brings ongoing passion for service members and their families to his current role as manager of training for the Military One Source program. Without further delay, I will turn things over to Michael Scott.
Great. Thank you very much, Stan, and hello, everyone, and welcome indeed to this presentation titled A Guide to Helping Children Manage Anger 3 to 12. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to present all this information to you, and I want to share that this is a topic that's near and dear to me. As Stan mentioned, I happen to have had the opportunity to work with children in an inpatient setting with both boys and girls who were all between the ages of 5 and 12. And anger was an emotion that every single one of them had some struggle with at some level. It was indeed anger and their difficulties with expressing and managing it that brought many of them to this particular facility. Many of the children and families that I did have the pleasure to work with, though, also happened to be military families, and this gave me the experience of working with children whose difficulties were at the extreme end of the spectrum, which may be different than the experience many of you have. But I'll also point out that I'm a father with 3 children, and all of whom happen to fall within this age range, and continue to need assistance in managing their own anger. So with that said, I'd like to take a moment as well to encourage you all to perhaps have a pen and paper handy so you can write down any questions that you might have or that come up for you. I'll also share some resources along the way. I think that if you like, you can write down as well. At the end, there will be a moment when there'll be some time for questions, and I'd certainly love to have the opportunity to answer any of those questions you may have and perhaps tailor some of the information specific to your situation. So before we really get rolling with the presentation, I do want to share this disclaimer. The appearance of hyperlinks does not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense of this website or the information, products, or services contained therein. For other than authorized activities such as military exchanges and morale, welfare, and recreation sites, the Department of Defense does not exercise any editorial control over the information you may find at these locations. Such links are provided consistent with the stated purpose of this Department of Defense sponsored webinar. Right, so you'll notice quickly that this particular presentation was created to assist teachers and caregivers who manage classrooms of children. And with multiple children's emotions all requiring some attention, I think we could probably all agree that classroom management can be very difficult and that it would be helpful to review some of the information and skills that teachers, parents, and caregivers can all consider when they assist children with managing anger. So just to take a moment to acknowledge some of those specific difficulties that those managing classrooms may face. Of course, there are lots of personalities, family dynamics, and cultures and temperaments all in one room. And, of course, that's true of any of the children that we might find ourselves in contact with. Culturally, people may express emotions differently than you do or what's normal for you. There's always in classrooms plenty of action and activity and demands of needy and disruptive children. And of course, there's stress for everyone in managing safety, ratios, activity level, and productivity, and all of those other details that teachers are responsible for. I would imagine, though, that in addition to teachers who may be out there and present today, there's likely also many parents or even perhaps social workers and counselors in the audience today, too. So taking some of this background in mind, I'll try to present the information in a way that it's relevant to you no matter if you're helping your own child manage anger, someone else's child, one child at a time, or many at a time. I hope you'll find the information throughout the presentation useful. Okay. So to begin, I thought it would be helpful to spend some time reviewing a bit of general information about anger and what exactly it is for all of us. And for what it's worth, I think it's helpful for kids to have an intellectual understanding, appropriate to their age, of course, of what anger is And knowing that it can just be having some awareness of that can just be one of the many steps a person can take towards having a greater ability to manage anger effectively. So a couple of things. I hope we're all aware that anger is certainly a normal emotion. And by normal, I'd say that there's unlikely to be any individual on earth who doesn't experience anger. It's normal, and it's simply a response, in fact, one of many, to stressors in our environment. I think this is an important note, especially to make note of to children, because they may not have that same awareness that many of us have as we grow up to the normalcy of feelings of anger. I also want to point out that just because we call anger a response doesn't mean that it's always entirely an involuntary one, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'll also point out that when children are angry and we're aware of their anger because they're acting in some way that would indicate such, we can be certain that they're attempting to communicate something with those behaviors. And I think it's really, really important that we maintain some awareness of this, as that awareness can help us to avoid personalizing their actions and the value of keeping that from hitting us in a personal way. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Here's some additional factors that make it difficult for children, though I'll also acknowledge that some of these factors make it difficult for adults just the same. Children in this age group generally lack skill and experience in managing strong emotions in general. There could be a huge variety of extenuating circumstances that could be contributing to the feelings that a child may be having, such as overwhelming experiences both at home or at school. And at times they're trying to communicate some need or want that they may have in the moment. And being aware of that and keeping each of these points in mind can oftentimes give us the opportunity to find an easy and direct solution. All right, so here's a couple of other points about anger. It's been said that anger is the oldest emotion and has indeed assisted us in survival throughout all time. I actually think that's a wonderful thing to share with children. I think it gives some intellectual component to anger and gets them thinking about it. And as I said earlier, I think that's valuable. Also, as children grow and learn, and since anger is such a universal emotion, it's without a doubt that children will experience it. I think one of our most important roles in assisting children manage anger is to teach them and to help them develop skills to communicate and deal with their thoughts and feelings, in particular here, anger. Since we mentioned earlier how anger is a reaction to stressors and that it has assisted us in survival, it's worthwhile to discuss that relationship just briefly. That feeling of anger that wells up when our brains perceive some form of threat, as a matter of survival, our nervous systems react by preparing us for either, and I'm sure we've all kind of had some familiarity with this idea before, but a fight or flight to survive kind of response. And I think nicely enough, for the vast majority of us, our world doesn't require that we always fight or flee in some physical way, but our bodies prepare us regardless. And so we can talk for a few minutes about the fight or flight response that many of us, like I said, have probably heard of before. The fight or flight response, which has also been, or which you may find if you were to look it up, is referred to currently as a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response in some contexts. And in particular, in contexts of working with children who've experienced trauma. But it is a very physiological reaction that occurs in response to a perceived harmful event, attack, or threat to survival. I think it's interesting to note that this is a physiological response, or something that actually happens within our bodies. And to be even more specific, upon this perceived threat, our brains produce, and I like this phrase, a hormonal cascade of chemicals, including the likes of epinephrine, norepinephrine, estrogen, testosterone, cortisol, dopamine, and serotonin, all powerful chemicals we may have heard of that have a huge effect on the way we feel and the things we do. And because this is all such a physiological thing, the fight or flight response is dependent on continuous messages from the brain or a persistent perception of threat. I think one way to look at it, or one way to share with our children when we're sharing this concept, is to think of using our brains as a muscle, and a very powerful one, and really sometimes the only one to help manage the anger. One of the reasons all of this information and giving this information can be helpful. So if we change or somehow interrupt certain messages, like perceived threats coming from our brains, we can change the response of the body. In addition to that, and I'll quote again, hormonal cascade, this sets off additional physiological responses that I think it can be helpful to be aware of. So things like nutrients rush to major muscle groups to power them up. The digestive system starts to shut down. The heart and lungs have to work harder and faster. Pupils will dilate, and the brain stops thinking things through and relies more on that autonomic nervous system to get things done. I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but some of these physiological reactions can be boiled down further when we think about children whose hands might start to become sweaty, or their fists or teeth begin to clench. And there are other noticeable signs that are the results of some of these physiological processes taking place. Right, so how does knowing all of this help? Well, I think there's a number of ways that all of this information can be useful. If we understand the value of interrupting that perceived threat, the fight or flight response diminishes, and then so does the intensity of the experience of anger. I think there are incredibly effective skills that can be directly taught to children in these age groups. And I'll add that while this presentation begins at 3 years old, I don't think it's ever too early to begin teaching and modeling these calming and awareness skills, some of which we'll talk about as we go through. So when considering how you might teach some of these skills, I think it's helpful to note that children thrive when living with structure and rules. I think this is probably pretty well known, but knowing this and consistently putting this into place can be a little bit more difficult. So I think we often have a general understanding that children will thrive with structure and rules, but actually consistently having them in place is a little harder. Sometimes feelings of anger in children can be that sort of, quote, fight against the rules. And you find things like a desire to hurt themselves or hurt others or to destroy things become some of the behaviors that we begin to deal with. And what's even more complicated about that is that oftentimes these behaviors can be extremely effective at getting them what they may be needing from you. They will be successful in gaining your attention. At times, your accommodation. They're effective at getting someone perhaps to leave them alone, or effective at providing them the opportunity to avoid something. So I think you get the picture how this cycle can escalate quickly. I think it becomes really important when we consider teaching children these skills to consider their need to express anger, and then to provide guidelines for how they can do that in a way that's appropriate. And I'll make a point about that. When we teach an alternate behavior for expressing a feeling, children will only start resorting to it if it's at least as effective as the undesirable behavior you're intending to steer them away from. So if we're encouraging them to use their words instead of stomping their feet, then we need to make sure that their words are as effective at getting them what they want or need as would be stomping their feet. So we can move a little forward and get into what I believe to be one of the most effective and easy and helpful skills one can learn for managing anger. And it's such a simple thing, indeed. And we talk about breaths and breathing. And indeed, breathing has been called the key to unlocking anger. So just breathing. So I find it almost ironic that it's something we all, most of our lives, take for granted. But this advice is something that we've all heard and is helpful, and something you'll continue to hear and to probably be taught over and over again throughout the course of our lives. It's always strange to me that something that's so constant in our lives and experience has so much room for growth, but it does. I think we know that yoga identifies effective breathing as a tenet of its practice. I can't help but be reminded of Lamaze and the natural breathing techniques for managing pregnancy and labor. And if you look closely enough, you'll find there are reminders to just breathe in all kinds of places. So, why is this helpful and effective? And one of the things that occurs to me is that the moment we become conscious of our own breath is a moment that we let go of many of the distractions of the things around us. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing, that just brief moment of self-awareness. Certain breathing strategies can be incredibly helpful for managing anger, and one of which we'll talk about more specifically over the next few slides, and it's this idea of breathe down to cool. It's a model that can be used, modeled, and as well taught. So quickly we'll address the idea of can we stop anger explosions, and I would imagine that there are those who are participating in this webinar in particular because perhaps they've experienced anger explosions from children who are theirs or perhaps others, and looking for ways to manage that is sometimes really necessary. So just a couple of notes to consider, I think, when we're teaching anger management skills. When hormones are in full flood, there's a point at which it's almost impossible, I'd say, to stop angry explosions. However, there are some things that can be done. But just to know, it's not usually an optimal time to attempt to verbally or overtly teach. This is the time to model and to perhaps distract. Many of us probably do have these questions about what can you do when the child's in the midst of an angry explosion. And I'll just note that one of the most effective strategies that I've discovered over time is to find, again, some means to distract. It can be really difficult to change tacts when this is happening, but it's really necessary. As a parent attempting to intervene in an angry explosion, we sometimes are committed to this perhaps lesson that we're trying to teach our child, and we can find it difficult to change tact. But once again, there's no greater thing to model than your ability to back away, perhaps from a power struggle, and to model calm, in control, consistent, and intentional calming strategies first. Then consider how you might interrupt the child's perceived threat. This can be done by beginning to color and inviting the child to follow. It can be done by taking a walk and, again, inviting the child to follow. And it can be done by engaging the child in an intellectual game, even such as things like rhyming games or puzzles or things like that can pull the child out of the heavy feelings place and engage their brain. Sometimes this can be just the distraction necessary to help them begin to find some calm. And that lesson that we might have been so intent on teaching can be learned once that child has regained some calm and ability to think. So it is necessary, I think, as well to note that it's certainly much easier to stop the cycle of anger before someone does get out of control, and we'll spend a good part of the remainder of the presentation talking more about that. All right, so another important aspect of teaching children to manage anger is to recognize that children will learn their most long-lasting lessons by watching what you're doing. So the need to observe your own anger responses is very important. And so the question becomes, what happens when you get angry? And unless you first manage your anger or frustration, it'll really be impossible for you to teach children to manage theirs. So again, I want to drive home the point about modeling good anger management skills, and children will take their cues from you. I have found in doing some counseling with families that children so frequently will mirror the emotions of their primary caregiver, oftentimes their mother, and have seen it and even pointed it out to parents with their children. But it's difficult for parents, I think, sometimes to see the degree to which that's happening. But it's easy to note from an outside observer that just as the child is escalating, so often does the parent, which does create a cycle where the child will always be willing to go to extremes that the caregiver cannot go to. So it has to be the caregiver who ultimately is the one who models restraint and awareness and an effort to cycle the intensity back down. So I think we can talk a little bit about that for a moment and the idea of awareness. All right, so here are some cues to very intentionally becoming aware of about ourselves. What are the things that happens when we get angry? We'll notice that our breathing can increase or become more shallow, and it's necessary. Even taking that brief moment to be aware of our breathing is an effort to calm. Hands and fingers, you can notice, are they moving rapidly or making fists? Eyes, are they darting around? Shoulders, are they raised up and near the ears? our eyes and our face, is there scrunching, or are they all tightened up? You can notice teeth, and oftentimes that's a quick thing to notice. Are they clenched? And whether these things are that you're noticing within yourself or within your child, I think that it's valuable to have the ability to call yourself out with accountability and hold yourself accountable for acknowledging, noticing these things, and making conscientious efforts to disrupt them. However, I think that there isn't a place to call these things out so specifically with your children. So if you're going to identify these signs in your child, I think you can do that from a, hey, this is interesting kind of perspective. I think this accomplishes a couple of things. It helps them become more self-aware without feeling like they're doing something wrong or feeling like they are in some kind of trouble. And it brings them into an intellectual place as well, and brings it into their brain space and out of that heavy feelings place. So approaching your awareness of these items, whether within yourself or within your child, can certainly help and is a great first step towards managing anger. All right, so just to summarize, or even perhaps give you some language to communicate this bit of information to your child, is that the fight or flight response kicks in, and it can kind of make your brain take a walk. Not a whole lot of thinking goes on when your brain is sort of out walking around. But when the hormone flood does stop, the brain can begin to work again. And thinking and reason will complete breaking the cycle of anger. And again, that speaks to this idea of moving children out of that feelings place and into that head place. Right, so I think there's the opportunity for us to give this breathing thing a try, and I'm not sure how often you all may find yourself with an opportunity to do this in life, but I can speak for myself and say far too infrequently do I take the brief moment that we're all about to take to have some self-awareness and practice taking a breath. So I'll ask you all to consider a couple things before we get started. You want to make sure your environment is safe around you, enough so that you can ignore it for a few moments and focus in on yourself. And you can kind of set the stage for this moment of practice at breathing. You can close your eyes if you like, and you can even consider perhaps starting up some relaxing music or background noise to help drown out all of the other distractions you might experience. So after a brief moment, I'd like you to just simply take a moment and gain some awareness of your natural breathing rhythm. And I'll do the same. Right. And now I'll ask you to take your hand and place it over your belly button so that you know where your belly button is. And you can take in a huge amount of air. Your belly button needs to move away from your spine. Your belly should fill up round, and your shoulders should rise up with all that air that you're breathing in. And with that breath in, you'll hold that breath for 3 counts. And then release the breath slowly to a 5 countdown by pulling your belly towards your spine until all of the air is gone. And then even push out a little bit more. This, very specifically, is a belly breath, and you can use it to model this idea of breathe down to cool. And indeed, I hope that was a moment that you might consider refreshing. I have to always ask when I find myself doing something like that, when was the last time I even took the briefest of similar moments to do something just like that? Something entirely about me, and it's true that it's very difficult to make time for sitting back and taking a breath. It's important to note that practicing this when we don't have to do this to calm down is always necessary, and I'd ask you to consider when might be the next time you would be willing to take that brief moment and make sure you're in a safe place and take that belly breath so that you can be confident when you show your child or children in a classroom how to do it, that they'll believe that you indeed are speaking from a place of authority. All right, so let's take a moment to further draw out the strategy of this idea of breathing down to cool. I think it's helpful when we describe emotions with some kind of tangible or concrete concept that children can follow, and color and temperature are things that, or ideas that children can indeed relate to. And this is rife throughout our language. I know we're all familiar with phrases such as "I'm feeling blue," or "she's so cold to me," or "I was seeing red," or the phrase of "don't get hot under the collar," or "chill," or "cool off." And I'm sure we could probably come up with many, many more examples where colors and temperatures are present to help us describe emotions. I think we can take these easily drawn analogies and use them as we think about interrupting that brain messaging and communicate with our children with clear and concrete concepts that they can understand. So to further that concept and to teach it to our children, or whether in groups or individuals, you can do a whole variety of activities. You can ask children to draw a picture that looks like they do when they're angry, or are they hot or cold? If anger had a color, what color would each person's anger be? You can have the children draw their own faces using those anger colors. You can absolutely teach and model belly breaths. You can demonstrate even with a colleague, giving you instructions in front of the children so that they can see. And then you can, it's helpful to make sure to implement a system of practice. It's nice to put even some structure around that, and a suggestion here is 2 times a day. It's really important to practice at times when you're not feeling stressed or when you don't need to, so that when the time arises that you do need to, it becomes a natural skill you'll employ. So as we're teaching the idea further of breathe down to cool, you can use language such as "we're breathing down to blue," and then count down 5, 4, 3, 2, cool. Or you can say something along the lines of counting down to cool and do the same thing. Okay, so now that we have some thoughts on teaching it, I think it's important to review how we can maintain and reinforce it. And as mentioned before, it's valuable to practice when the child is not angry. You can certainly single children out by asking them to reinforce the model "breathe down to cool," and be sure you ask the cool-headed children as well as the more hot-tempered children equally. And you can work to help them recognize and be aware of their own physical cues to anger and breathe down on their own, recognizing that the child, when you see him or her use a belly breath, to breathe down. This is a strategy that I have that's sort of a part of the culture in my own home, is recognizing when the children and kids are using a breath as some kind of strategy. And I can't help but not point it out anymore, and I hear it as soon as it happens, but what I often notice in my own children, and it's an indicator that they're calming down, is when they're taking that breath in and they're calm enough that that breath becomes at the top end of it, and that tells me that they just took a deep enough breath that their body is starting to cool, which gives them the opportunity to breathe a deep enough breath out that they're settling. So I listen for that, and I cue into it every time, and I praise them up and down when I hear it, because it's a cue to me that they're on the way down. Some other strategies that you can put into practice, and I think it's important to remember that this only works for interrupting the cycle and before the intensity can go off the scale, but you can certainly do things like getting the person's attention and being eye to eye. I often found that getting down on my knees or even sitting on the floor allowed for the children to come a little off of the defensive since you're on their level. I think judiciously you can use a gentle touch or a slow, steady, friendly voice. You can take a big breath in while saying, "Let's breathe down now," and then asking and checking in, "Are you cool?" When your lungs are full, you can hold up your hand and count down. That way you're not expiring your own breath while you're counting. And you can do things like hold it. You can begin to breathe out slowly while you count down from, again, 5, 4, 3, 2, and using cool at the end to remind them of what the goal is. It's important, I think, to hold eye contact as you move other children away and manage any conflict or source of frustration. And of course, and once again, modeling those belly breaths and body positions as you're doing it is even more valuable than teaching it verbally. Okay, so in conclusion, don't forget to help the ones who learn how to breathe down to cool and have them teach the others. And again, if we listen, see, and do, that's when we learn. And if we teach, ultimately we'll remember those things. All right, so I'd like to share a few resources just before I go through the summary. This is a moment perhaps if you wanted to write them down, though they are easy to remember as well. The militaryOneSource.mil website, and again that's militaryOneSource, all one word, .mil, has a number of articles on anger management. Those that are there are geared both toward the individual or the adult as well as toward the family. Two in particular, one called Anger Management is found upon a search for anger management, and then it's called Understanding and Controlling Anger, and many of the concepts that are there are certainly relevant to children as well. And the other one, Anger Management for Service Members and Their Families, again provides a number of strategies and helpful understanding of ways to manage anger. There's a fantastic YouTube video, and one that I use regularly in my own family, called Progressive Muscle Relaxation for Kids and Adults. If I remember correctly, it lasts about 11 minutes and takes children through a calming process and muscle relaxation. We will employ that or use that in the evenings when we know we can be prepared for the natural power struggle that comes from there being a bedtime. And oftentimes this is a way that we will bring our children down, so to speak. There's a great kids book called Mad Isn't Bad, and that's a children's book about anger. It, for what it's worth, it comes up first in a search on similar topics on Amazon. The author is Micheline Mundy, and that's Michaelene, Mundy. And again, the book is called Mad Isn't Bad, and I've found that to be a great book, I want to say geared towards 7 or 8-year-olds, that I think can be helpful. There's a great movie, if you're not already aware, that came out recently called Inside Out. I want to say that I have not seen it, so I'm hesitant to fully recommend it, but my daughter has, and she's 8, and she loved it. And the reason I would recommend it here is that it gave characters to the various emotions that the main character was feeling sort of inside her brain. And the wonderful thing that I found about that particular movie was it gave my daughter and I a context for talking about specific emotions. So I thought that would be helpful as well to others. And just for interest's sake, there's an app I like as well, in particular for Apple products. I'm not sure if it's available elsewhere, but it's called SleepStream. I'm sure we probably all have apps for this, but the nice thing about SleepStream is it gives me a variety of relaxing music that I can play and begin on demand when I feel like I want to model some calming processes for my kids. So those are some that I have found helpful, and I'm sure there's other. If you were to do a search in any of those sites, you'll probably find quite a bit more. In fact, children's books written on the topic of feelings and emotions are of huge quantity. Oops. I did want to review this quick summary. So anger is a normal emotion and a response to stress. The fight or flight response is dependent on continuous messages from the brain. Interrupting negative messages to the brain stops the response. Recognizing our physical cues can help stop the anger cycle. Belly breathing can calm us down and interrupt the fight or flight response. It's our jobs to help children practice this idea of breathe down to cool when they're actually not angry. And it's helpful for us to encourage them to teach others. And so with that, I'd love to open it up to any questions that may be out there.
Thanks, Mike. We did have some questions come in.
Great.
First question reads, how do you know when your kids need help handling anger?
Well, I'd say that there's a few sort of hard stop boundaries that I'll mention in this answer, and then there are those that are more unique to our individual families. And so when you say when the question is your kids, I'm going to assume it's the kids that are yours in the home, though I would certainly say that it could be applicable to kids you might find in your classrooms as well. I'd say the hard stops that I'd be aware of are when the behaviors that are the result of the anger that a child might be feeling are such that the child is in danger or other children are in danger or the potential for destruction exists. I think in any of those scenarios, help is warranted, and that help can range depending on the intensity of what you're experiencing. There's a variety of help that can be employed. I'd say I'd start with individual attention to the child to see if that has any help or any effect on the frequency and intensity of the behaviors. I have found it's helpful for me in considering that exact question with my own, one of my children in particular. It was helpful to track our experiences along the way. So we created a scale, and we actually wrote it on the bathroom mirror when we encountered any of her tantrums, and the scale was on intensity, and we would put a date for that particular outburst. And when we felt like the intensity had increased, we felt like our interventions needed to increase. And when we felt like the intensity showed an increase, we felt like our interventions needed to increase. It was the cue for us to engage our child in counseling specifically because we saw a dramatic increase at one point. And we've now found that counseling to have been incredibly helpful. So I'll note that if counseling is something you find yourself wanting to pursue, I think that Military OneSource can be one great route, although since we are talking about children 5 to 12, individual counseling for children under the age of 13 isn't something that Military OneSource does. However, family counseling is, and children under the age of 13 can participate in the context of family counseling. If the counseling is more specific to the child, then I would certainly recommend considering either your workplace insurance or TRICARE to pursue that. The other thing I wanted to note, so there are some hard stops, and I wanted to say that safety and the potential for destruction are the places where I draw those hard lines. But otherwise, it's the functionality within your family or within your classroom. If the behaviors are disruptive significantly to the functioning of your family, if you're finding, for example, that with too great a frequency you're unable to perhaps get to school on time or attend after-school functions because the behaviors are prohibiting that for you or the other children, then based on the context of your family or, again, of your classroom, it could be that you decide a more intense intervention could be helpful or necessary. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. The next question reads, I'm having trouble communicating with my students during moments of extreme frustration and aggression. Any suggestions?
Absolutely. I think communicating verbally at all when any child is in a midst of extreme experience of any emotion, whether it's excited or angry or intensely sad or intensely happy, many of the same physiological things are happening within the child already, and the ability to be heard by the person trying to deliver a message is almost non-existent. I would say communication is possible. Verbal communication is less possible. The communication that you can do, and what I have found effective, is to sort of come alongside that person who's experiencing that intense emotion. And again, to get down onto a very similar level. So if that means sitting in front of them or coming below even their eye level, it can tend to diminish their perceived threat. And then inviting them to participate in some activity with you. And I work very hard to find unique distractions. In fact, I'd love to give a training fully on this topic because I think this is a relevant one. But I have found that engaging someone, especially when they're experiencing intense feelings, in an intellectual banter can be really helpful. So things like riddles I've found effective, things like folding origami, things like coloring, taking a walk, tossing a ball. I can kind of go on and on. This is perhaps not the most politically correct phrase, but I'll share it as well, as it was a social worker who shared it with me. But one intervention I had employed was to take a walk and then ultimately walk to the beach and walked hip deep in the middle of winter, and just to kind of pull the person out of an intense feeling, and the social worker described it as, I had out-crazied the crazy. So again, not so politically correct, but I think you get the idea that sometimes the more interesting you're willing to go, the more likely you'll get a distraction off of that feeling that child may be experiencing so intensely. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks. At this time, we don't have any other questions that have come in, but I would like to thank you, Michael Scott, for sharing your invaluable experience and expertise, and also adding your own personal touch there. I would also like to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. If you find yourself having questions after the webinar is over, please email moswebinars@militaryOneSource.com, and I'll send the questions over to Mike, and we'll get an answer back to you as soon as we can. This concludes today's webinar on a guide to helping children manage anger, ages 3 to 12. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.